Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today I am delighted to say that I'm speaking to Rob, and we're going to be talking about all things HR, human resources. Well, not necessarily all things, but many things about HR. I hope you enjoy this. I am certainly looking forward to it. Welcome, Rob. How are you doing?
Hi, Mike. I'm very well, thank you.
Thanks very much for taking the time to talk about HR, your profession. Full disclosure, I've known Rob for several years, and we've worked together on some bits and pieces. We do not always agree, but there are times we definitely do agree. And one of the things that I've always liked about you is your ability to reflect, your ability to consider what's happened, what needs to change, and also to, I suppose, in many ways, which I consider to be a strong leadership trait, to look at where maybe the situation needs to change, or you yourself need to change, which I just wished a lot more people thought about. Anyway, to begin then, and on that subject of change, if you don't mind, let's talk about mistakes. Mistakes in the first instance that you would say that the HR profession can make. I'm not saying they do or do all the time, but what sort of mistakes can HR make?
Well, it's a good question and a tough one, Mike. Obviously, I think mistakes are something that all functions make, but I think within human resources, some of the common mistakes that human resources make, I think, are around just taking decisions made from leadership and implementing them, not really thinking through all the implications. So being very transactional, and sometimes there's a place for implementation, but sometimes you have to challenge how things are being carried out. I think also just assuming things generally and getting under the skin of the business. I think a lot of HR practitioners don't take it upon themselves to really understand the business, and you can't be immune from the business when you're working within the business. So I think a lot of mistakes can be made just from those assumptions and not thinking through what all the implications are. But the other point is that a mistake can be made by not challenging how something is going to happen. Sometimes the end goal is still the end goal, but the way you go about it can be very different. And I think that's whether you bring people with you with the change or whether you lose them on the way. And yes, it might be on the Gantt chart, but we're a bit more than Gantt chart driven, I would hope. Yeah.
Thank you. I certainly have seen, obviously the details going to be different, or it's likely to be different in terms of our experiences, but I've seen things like that, and it's one of those, what is it, the old sort of, is it a joke, is it a saying, is it an axiom, HR, we're here to help, and then people head for the hills because they're worried, what is going on, what's about to go wrong. Not always the case, and of course I don't mean to say that everyone in the profession is either good or bad. It's like any profession. There are, there's good plumbers, not so good plumbers, physicians, electricians, you name it. What then, in terms of, you, the person, the professional, what would you say are some of the mistakes that you've made over the years?
Gosh, that's a tough one, Mike. I guess early in my career, I think one of the things I probably did as a mistake is I would go to management meetings, and you go through the management pack, and you get to the very end of the pack, as was always the case, and there'd be the one slide on the people metrics about turnover, retention, health and safety metrics, etc. And that sense of thinking that was the role that HR played, that one slide in the operational review of 60, 70 pages. And then you had the aha moment when you realise all the things we've been talking about, whether it's been about driving sales and how do you drive sales performance, looking at operational efficiency, looking at engineering billable hours, looking at how anything is done in the organisation, it impacts the people. And that HR person has to realise that they're involved in everything. They're not just involved in their one little slide presentation. I think that was a mistake made early, to think it was pigeonholed, and really it should be not in a sort of a all-consuming way, but really HR should be everywhere. It should be listening, should be learning, curious about what's happening, and not sitting in its corner waiting to receive information or requests. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, that is really interesting, because one of my experiences, either working alongside or indeed being in an organisation where there were HR individuals and leaders around, both of those situations, yes, I have seen it would seem HR not thinking about the full implications. And again, I would, an important point to put in, I would say that is not every HR person in every situation. There are some phenomenal HR people out there, but I have seen that, and to me it's like, well, isn't that what you should have been thinking about? But of course people can get tied up in systems and process, which I also understand. And with that theme then of what are the mistakes, HR and then you, and thank you very much for sharing them. What have you learned? But before I ask you personally, what do you think HR needs to learn to improve? The implication being that it needs to improve in some areas. That's my opinion. It may not be yours. Perhaps I'm being presumptuous.
Yeah, that's a huge question, but absolutely. I mean, every function, every organisational part of any organisation, any function has to improve. And I think human resources has come through a long journey. So, when I stepped into that world back in the 90s, it was personnel morphing into human resources. Now we're touching people and culture. And, I get a bit frustrated with the terminology shifting all the time, because accountants don't become suddenly the numbers team, but there's this sense that HR is needing to sort of reconnect with a new name, a new sort of strapline. But I think going back to what HR needs to improve, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think it has to be much braver at working with managers. Managers are the ones that make the tough decisions, but the managers are the ones that also have to manage and lead people. And I think HR can make mistakes sometimes. And there'll always be good excuses, and there'll be good, valid excuses. Haven't got enough time, or the sheer volume of work that they have to get out means that they have to push things out more. But I think they have to spend more time coaching and mentoring. They don't have to be coaches, but I think you can have, it's a cliche, but there's 5-minute coaching conversations down the corridor or at the water cooler in the kitchen. You step outside with somebody, you can coach them. So I think there's that coaching element, that arm around them, proverbially speaking, metaphorically speaking, I should say. And I think also HR has to remember that they are deeply rooted to the business as well, because I think you can get down the rabbit hole of what's the newest HR system, what's the new training course for this, what's the law on that, but actually what are the demands of the business? We know, it's hard to not know that some of the biggest challenges to our whole world is the impacts of AI, but also I think the impacts are on how we work post-COVID, but also for me, one of the biggest challenges is how we work generationally. The hearsay is that different generations require different ways of working, and we have to adapt to that. We can get grumpy and frustrated if we're a Generation X or a Boomer or whatever, but actually we're all connected in an organisation, and we don't want to have more disconnection. We want to have unity of purpose and unity of how you work. So I think HR has to be that connecting force, as well as being that brave supporting role with leadership. So I think there's a few roles there to play, and not get stuck behind the data and reporting. I think that's the sort of the past game now. I think they have to be at the table and be very confident in what they're doing, and the fact they see everything. I think that's one thing people forget. They see everything, and they shouldn't forget that, and they can connect things, which not every function can. So.
Thanks, Rob. I have to say that's music to my ears. I do believe that, and I didn't know what you were going to say. I mean, we haven't rehearsed this. I wasn't sure what your opinion would be, but now you've expressed it. It resonates deeply with me. I do believe that is often what is missing. It's missing with a lot of managers, stroke leaders across the board. But I just think it's also so intrinsic to what HR needs to be, that without that bravery, without that sitting at the table, that being involved, that saying, hey, I'm seeing all this and this, I think my opinion is valid, and to make sure it's heard is so important. What then, in terms of the sort of changes, the learning from you personally? The mistakes you made in the past. What have you learned from those mistakes?
I think I learned probably very early on, probably going back to sort of the first role I had really that was outside of so I started life in sort of a corporate office. I think you probably know that story, but sort of back in '06, seems like a lifetime ago, I guess it is, I had my first operational role. And I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it most because I realized I was now really operating in a business role capacity. So the functional name might have been HR, but really I was a business person. And I think that was a real aha moment for me, because I like HR, I'm passionate about what HR does, but actually I don't want to just be that niche individual within an organization. And I think people can hide behind their titles. So I think that recognition that HR people had to be business people, so it meant they had to be curious, they had to be interested. Doesn't mean you become an expert in the technology your organization does. It doesn't mean you have to become an expert in Six Sigma. It doesn't mean you have to be an expert on Salesforce, systems, but you have to have an understanding about what everyone else is doing. What are the other pressures of other people? What are the business pressures? How does the operation work? What is profit and loss? The real basics, because I think otherwise you're stuck in that role of supporting, coming up with ideas, being a bit disconnected with budgets and with initiatives, and then that's where you get that conflict, I think. So I think that's what I learned early on. You've got to be business minded and remain curious. I think when you're not being curious, when you're not being interested in what's going on, I think you're failing, because you're back in the trenches. And I think when I have gone back in, it's there might have been restructuring or projects, you realize you're not operating at full capacity. You are a less good version of yourself. So I think that's the challenge to yourself constantly, to say, am I above the parapet enough? Am I seeing what's happening? Am I helping the organization rather than just acting on what I'm asked to do? So, but being that business person is key. I think that's really, really vital. And I think for many people, they say, well, of course, I'm a business person. For many people, they don't want to be, and that's fine, but they might then need to go down a specialism and be that, that L&D specialist or the reward specialist, because we need those experts. And their roles can be more specialised because their very nature is very complex. But I think if you're a generalist, which is what I've chosen to be for all these years, you've got to be broad-minded and look at everything in a very pragmatic way and sort of business-minded way. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, absolutely fascinating. Didn't know you were going to say that. One of the words that leapt out is curious. I've talked about this. I was talking about it quite recently, in fact, and I think that one of the ways that people can remain fresh and not get into the tram line thinking and the echo chamber and it's just the way we do things around about here, is to be curious. But I also think it helps for leaders generally, and I do believe that we need more HR leaders like the ones that you have described, or that aspirational quality. And in fact, maybe we'll come on to that. That's actually, let's cover that in a moment. The curious word can also mean that people's ego is dialed down, because there's something I've got to learn today. Yes. There's something I've got to understand.
Yes.
But when you see this sort of imperious look of some people, not necessarily HR, but some people in positions, they know it all, and I think that's a danger sign for the business team and the individual. So then, talking about, or I mentioned, moving forward, then just building on what mistakes, what are the learnings, moving forward for the profession. I know you've sort of touched on this already, but if you were given the magic wand, how would you structure? What would you change? What would you focus on in terms of HR? And I know that that term is big, it's sprawling, so I obviously don't expect intricate detail, but maybe you will go into intricate detail. But what are your thoughts on that? What needs to be changed? What does it look like when it's going to be like good? Not necessarily great, but if you want to use great, well, we can go there as well.
We'll start maybe at good. That's a huge question, Mike. I think that is a great question to ask, because I think what we're looking at is the world is changing dramatically, not just what's going on geopolitically, but I think the seismic changes of having a global pandemic and the impact on hybrid working and enabling more people to work for organisations that maybe they couldn't have worked for because of the geography or because of the childcare or the caring or whatever other capacity they would have. So I think one of the biggest challenges of our profession for the next 10, 20 years probably, if I'm realistic, is the fact that we've got to think about how we look at the way that we work. So we've got this newer generation coming to the workforce who have a different idea about how work should be, which is not a bad thing. We have the generation of my own, which is probably more like the boomers, which was around head down, get the job done, make sacrifices, not always work as efficiently, but there's an element of presenteeism and look how hard I've worked and I've done this many hours in a week. With this other generation coming in and challenging all that and saying what's in it for me, and we can't give everything, but I think it is a good flip to say, well, how do we look at the purpose of work? Because we need to connect people, but I don't think necessarily, and I don't have the answer for this, but I don't think necessarily the way we operate can be the way we continue operating, because that younger group in time will be the leaders of the organisation. So they in turn will probably look at things differently. And we've also got to think about what the impact of AI will be. And although I don't subscribe to everything the media says, clearly all of us, even some people that are not as technically minded, are using Copilot and other means to support them in some aspects of their work. You roll forward 5 or 10 years, there's an awful lot of clerical admin, but also modelling and various other work within organisations across a number of functions that won't be required. So does that create an opportunity for more people to do more interesting work, or potentially does it create a problem that we have more people with more leisure time and we're going to have to work towards not having a 5-day working week and we're looking at a 4-day working week or 3.5-day working week? And although people might say that was considered years ago when computers were introduced and that's not changed, I'm not convinced that won't be a challenge we have. And actually, when you look at the challenge also with retirement age, no longer existing, men and women living and working longer because of affordability, how do you enable younger people to have worthwhile, fulfilling careers early on if you've got that age group sticking around the workforce? But if you were to move towards a different dynamic in the workforce in terms of the working week, that could be a way forward. So there's an awful lot of challenges there. On top of that, just in terms of the global competitiveness of everything, makes every business need to be thinking about investments and affordability and everything else. Some very sort of parochial issues, aren't there, in the UK around the government's play on NI and potentially on pensions and everything else. But those are small issues, I think, in the scheme of things. I think the bigger issues, the seismic issues, are around how do we enable this intergenerational piece to work well so there's not conflict, we work in harmony, age and experience is respected both ways rather than one way, and also recognising that the hybrid working model actually works really well. And it might shift, but I think it works really well. And it doesn't matter whether you've got a young child, whether you've got a dog, whether you've got a caring responsibility, or the fact that you enjoy working out at a gym twice a week. That shouldn't prevent you from having that opportunity. As long as you can still connect and be available in a reasonable amount of time, I think that's, it is, as one boss said to me, it's ultimately about outputs and about trust. So anyway, maybe a longer answer to that initial question, because it's a huge question, Mike. But yeah, there's some initial thoughts on what's coming down the line, I think, for human resources.
It's a great answer. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating what you were saying. I must say, although we're all probably aware of AI, the thought of it in relation to your function globally is that's quite something. And also more leisure time, and also that really important point about younger people. Where's the route in for them to get into some of those roles and to move and to be mobile in business? That's huge in terms of challenges. But obviously, the goal would be that HR, or whatever we would want to call it, because that may change as well with all the changes going on, whatever we want to call it, but let's call it HR for the moment, the function needs to be fleet-footed enough and adept enough and forward-thinking enough to actually preempt some of that stuff. If not, then it's going to be like, well, caught by surprise doesn't quite describe it. In terms of you then, Rob, what do you see as your way forward? What will you do differently? You've got the mistakes, you've got the learnings. What then do you think is Rob? I almost said 2.0, but I won't. Oh, I did. Sorry, that's so cheesy. But hopefully you get my gist, because I know you're deeply reflective. I know you're one of the people out there, which is great. You have a conscience, you care, you get involved, and I've seen you evolve and change in some ways, and I hope you've seen the same from me. Maybe not as much as you, but what do you see as your evolution then? What's different going forward for Rob in terms of the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think one thread really, Mike, I think, is that need to be much more focused on professional development. So I think, whether it's all the raft of changes on employment law, there's a need obviously to make sure that every HR practitioner is fully immersed and understanding of all the impacts and all the implications, not just the headlines. I think, there's a lot of great stuff out there about AI. In fact, there was a wonderful AI webinar that I saw through a law firm. And, I think it's about basically continual development and not doubting that you can learn more. I mean, I think about parental generation working with computers after nearly 40 years of working, they adapted pretty quickly. So I think as myself, so whether it's understanding more about AI, more about the law, and I think with my own personal sort of choices, I'm working, as you know now, sort of in a sort of interim capacity. What I really want to be doing is working with organisations and connecting people and working through the tough stuff, working through the changes. I'll let the systems people do the system stuff. But I think there's a missing piece around how we connect, and it can be small businesses that are building up and growing up, or it can be big businesses going through significant change. I think one of the wonderful things I've done in my career is I've worked across all cultures really imaginable, and really worked hard at getting them to understand how you have to operate differently in order to not just be effective, because that sounds like we're very robotic and transactional, but to really enjoy those experiences and to come away and feel like they felt like they knew Rob rather than it was HR. Because I think what saddens me is when people talk about HR and it's almost always in a derogatory way. I think that means that HR has to sort of take itself down from the parapet and always be on the ground and be accessible, because that's where with that openness and transparency sort of allows people to, I think, to share more and to be more probably more open with HR too. But I think on my personal level, I think it's learning. I think it's remaining interested in what's going on. I mean, there's so much going on. I mean, you probably know I did a political science degree, but I see the geopolitical piece bigger than ever, impacting, and the whole thing around globalization is fascinating, isn't it? When you've had organisations that have relied on manufacturing and R&D in multiple parts of the world suddenly reflecting on whether they need to move back to a more local spot. So there's tons out there, and I think for me it's learning, staying abreast of what's going on, both from an HR perspective, on a business perspective, but also what's going on around the world and beyond the headline. So it is being well read, and it's choosing wisely so you get a good range of inputs. Without wanting to advertise anything out there, but there are lots of good reads out there which are available online and via other means. So.
Thank you, Rob. And last couple of questions from me is, just as you were talking through in this conversation, one word that sort of sprang to mind is regret. And because for me, it's a big driver. I think for a lot of people, it's by the time you feel it's too late. One of those powerful and painful emotions very often. Any regrets, and I'm without being specific,
sure,
but just broadly speaking, regrets that would drive you to do something differently this time round, given similar circumstances, broadly similar circumstances. So anything that you regret and you think, looking back, I should have done that differently, and here's what I would do going forward. Are you able to answer that without breaching confidences, which I appreciate is really important in your role?
Yeah, I mean, clearly I've made mistakes, and I regret certain things I've done or not done. I think in terms of specific examples, it is hard without talking too much to the details. But I think one of the regrets probably is around not speaking up enough around that management table, that boardroom table, when you feel that something's missing, but not always having that confidence to sort of articulate that in that environment, thinking that you may not have that viewpoint sort of validated. So I think being braver on all occasions. I mean, because ultimately, if you're respectful and you're ready for the feedback, then you should always be able to contribute in a meeting and share your concerns. So I think that regret probably is something I have from the past in terms of not allowing that to continue and being comfortable in having your opinion and having it validated or not, but still, flagging it up. I think other than that, I think regrets, things you move on from. I think, as I say, I've been lucky with my career so far. I've moved roles many times. When I was showing maybe slight signs of disinterest in an opportunity, I was lucky to have managers that would give me new opportunities, which, looking back, were wonderful opportunities. And I think really, I have a lot of those managers to thank actually for those development sort of moments. But I think the regrets you park now. I think it's about what's the focus now. The focus is on learning. It's remaining relevant, harnessing the experience that you've got, and not seeing that as anything other than a great advantage. Interim roles to come. I think it's about using those opportunities, and without specifically saying, when I was at X, I did that, but it's thinking, I remember there was a moment when something similar happened, and I know the characters are different and the environment's different, but it feels like there's some similar things happening here, and this might be a way to approach things. It doesn't mean we have a playbook. I don't have a playbook. I think it's arrogant to think you just have a playbook you roll out, because you've got to understand the culture and the nuance. So I think that I sort of stepped away from mistakes, but I think the future is about staying interested, staying relevant, being focused. And you're right. I think you made the point, being humble, remain humble, because I think you've got to remain with that humility in order to really operate effectively. Once you start to show signs of arrogance or whatever else, I think the view of HR becomes, again, very negative, and the doors close, and your value probably diminishes overnight. So
Thank you, Rob. And I guess the last question in my mind at the moment, at least, but probably one that is actually about very much over to you. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I just think it's a great time to be in this profession. I think there's a huge amount of challenges, and I think, we touched on this before around, if you just take AI as one example, it's not just the impact on the HR function, it's the impact on the entire organisation. So I think it's about HR stepping up to know its role is to not be worrying about itself, but to be thinking, how do I contribute to support the organisation and to support our people? Because we're going through a huge amount of change, coupled with global pandemic only 5 years ago, wars around the world impacting supply chains, trade wars. There's a huge amount of uncertainty. So I think HR has never had a more important role to play, actually. So I think it's an exciting time to be, but we need brave, we need authentic, we need transparent, honest people that can shoulder that work and not shy away from it all. But I think it's exciting. I think it's a time to be not asking permission to be at the top table. They're at the top table. Stop changing our names, be what we are, whether we're people or HR, whatever we want to call ourselves. Let's just focus on getting the job done and being a really effective contributor. So,
Sounds good to me, Rob. Well, I have to say thank you very much. That's been really interesting, absolutely fascinating. And I hope and I trust that the people who listen to this and watch this will get a lot out of it. And, all I can say is really appreciate you taking the time. It's been hugely enjoyable and extremely informative. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Mike.